Hi, I'm Karis, and this is
Charmaine, and you're listening to Uncommon Humanity. Today's episode is titled Words Matter, and it's half a follow-up of an episode that we dropped in December last year called Stop Saying, God Said So.
We need to issue a word of caution because some of today's content contains homophobic language. We'll be discussing a Vice article where some unkind comments were made by Christians towards LGBTQ persons, and we'll also be mentioning the Aware saga in 2010.
Please be aware that our views are not necessarily the official views of our church, The Evolution, and we reserve the right to change our mind on the issues. We hope this episode gets you thinking and thoughtful that how we use our words can either harm or make the world better. It's been 2 weeks since the riots at Capitol Hill on January 6th, so if you're following the news, you should have heard about it by now. Joe Biden will be inaugurated as the next US president in a few days' time, and Donald Trump has become the first US president to ever be impeached twice. Now, we don't know how the whole scenario is going to play out, but frankly, I hope the Senate actually convicts him. Yeah, because if you don't know this, if Donald Trump is convicted of having incited violence during the Capitol Hill incident, he will actually get his rights as a former president taken away, which means $200,000 worth of yearly allowance, a $1 million yearly budget for travel, for speaking, budgets for having an office, etc., etc. So all that will be taken away, and so will his ability to continue to spread division and discrimination. Yeah. So you would have seen, right, guys, the shocking footages and pictures of the riot. And so today we're going to speak a little bit from our position as Christians, how we feel about that, especially about rioters who held up signs like Jesus Saves, Jesus 2020. There was another guy with a big holy Bible, etc., etc. And it's just been a really crazy what some Christians can do in the name of Jesus.
Yeah, I think what happened in Capitol Hill is just really horrible. Because violence in the name of anything is unacceptable. And especially for anyone to proudly raise a flag claiming Jesus and yet outrightly still do violence to another is just make you think about or wonder what actually happened for faith to have gone so wrong.
Yeah. And I think another thing that struck me was because the week that it happened, of course, a lot of pictures came out on Instagram. And just seeing the contrast of the pictures between the peaceful Black Lives Matter protest just months ago at Capitol Hill versus this violent riot. And then to see how the National Guard was deployed with such fierceness and force. And then now in the reverse, the National Guard didn't show up for hours before this thing really got out of hand. So it really makes it very hard to say that there isn't really a major racism problem at play, that Trump has not been crucial in inciting white supremacists in America. So it's just really, really crazy. Yeah, but we should say violent fundamentals are not the majority of Christians, in the US. However,
many prominent Christian leaders whom we deem mainstream evangelical have contributed to polarization, to violence.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, they have been saying Donald Trump is here to save America from abortion.
I'm sorry, that was a bit too big of a laugh that I just gave. Okay. Trump is here to save America. Okay. Post-riot, right? Many have backtracked their support. But however, Paula White has made an appearance again during this whole saga. We mentioned her in episode 2, Trump's spiritual advisor, as she's called, because she was out really just rallying people behind him in prayer. And again, she was leading prayer at the pro-Trump rally just before some of his supporters stormed Capitol Hill. So if you would search on the internet, you'll find out actually there are still, some Christian leaders are backtracking. They're apologizing. But then there are a few still digging in that God said so, and Trump is from God, and this is a spiritual battle that we're fighting.
Yeah, as we are saying, it's like there are consequences when we kind of use or take God's name in vain. Like what PC you mentioned, like how some of them has like backtracked, but then there are people who kind of say like, I gotta hold on to like God. I mean, God has called Donald Trump. This is his plan.
Yeah, and you made a really good point, right? About why can't losing be part of the plan?
Yes, I mean, I was wondering like, why can't losing the election be part of the plan then? I mean, like, God doesn't need us to resort to violence to defend his plan.
Yeah, definitely not violence.
Yeah, and the fact that if we have to go to violence, then we need to ask ourselves, is it God that we are advocating, or is it our own agendas that we are kind of protecting?
Yeah. And as Carrie so aptly put in now in episode 2, leaders really do create a huge downstream impact on their followers, and especially on followers who maybe are not mature enough or nuanced enough yet in their faith. So one of the crazy things, right, that I noted during the whole course of this event is that the crowd that stormed Capitol Hill was actually such a mix of people. And it really actually departs from our elitist stereotypes, right? There is only and I'm admitting to my own stereotype right now that like the uneducated would be the ones who would buy into extremism.
Yeah.
But the whole group was made up of CEOs, millionaires, then an Olympic swimmer in the US, veterans. So I think it's very clear, right? In this case, polarization is no respecter of education or status.
Yeah.
And I think we need to start really figuring out how to talk to one another in a way that is productive and engages instead of disengages and resorts to violence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the point is like words and religion can be very powerful things, and the way that we wield it, like in how we language our faith, can have very like serious or dangerous impact. And if you, like what we say, if we believe something has been called by God or ordained by God, then, and especially if we're not trained to think critically about it, then we kind of think in a very extreme way.
Yeah.
Where people start to kind of fight, and they need to stand up, and they need to kind of resort to violence.
Like it's good or evil.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think what we want to bring across in this episode really is, I think what happens is, the name of God really gets used to justify a lot of unkind and rigid behavior. Of course, in this case, we're citing a very extreme case. Actually, you know what's really... Actually, what scares me, because in 2 days' time, Joe Biden's going to get inaugurated, right? But, you know, right now, the FBI in the US expects armed assaults on Capitol buildings in all 50 states during the inauguration.
Oh, my.
So it's just really unthinkable at this point,
Yeah.
Yeah, so we want to ask the question today, right? Why is it Christians can get so caught up in a fight of what they think is right or good or like heaven or hell, out? And I think it's just becoming really, really problematic, because I think especially in Pentecostal evangelical circles, I think one of the problems is that church has very militant language in the way that we pray.
True.
Yeah. Now, let me qualify. It is in the Bible. There is military language in the Bible. But I think not in proportion to the amount with which we use it in our daily church life and prayer life.
Yeah.
Especially in the context of prayer, which is most contemporary churches are very Pentecostal evangelical nowadays. So we use language like, wow, it's a spiritual battle. We need to win the victory. We need to conquer in the name of Jesus. We need to stand up for Jesus. And so I think what's happened is Christianity has created a very antagonistic us versus them, Jesus versus the world kind of dichotomy. And it's our language is really starting to make its way into how we relate to people, to one another. Yeah.
So in the midst of all this, Donald Trump was banned from Twitter and supposedly suspended from YouTube as well. PC, how do you feel about that?
I am happy. Okay, so here's an interesting fact. It took 56,000 tweets for Twitter to finally decide it was time to silence Donald Trump.
Oh my gosh, 56,000.
Okay, now listen, there are good arguments for and against the ban, okay? So some people push back, even from Democratic-leaning people. Some of them push back and they said, it might not be a good idea because number one, banning his voice creates more echo chambers, which is already a problem with polarization.
Yes.
But secondly, one of the big concerns was that it would start to push possible threats underground, making it harder for the authorities to track possible violent elements lah. So I think those are very good, very, very good points to make. And then there was also another point which I found very, very captivating for me personally, which is they said most of Silicon Valley, Twitter, Facebook, all this stuff is owned by liberal leaning CEOs.
Wow.
And so they worry about disproportionate ban towards conservative voices. Okay, so we're going to use right and left pretty a lot in our conversation. So just to define it for you, right? When we say right over here, it means like more conservative of the spectrum, and left being more liberal of the spectrum in America lah.
Yes.
Okay, so but here's what's very interesting. Okay, so there was a Business Week report that week that there is some evidence that shutting Trump down had an immediate ripple effect on the internet. Okay, so they were reporting on this group called Media Matter, which is a liberal, leaning media advocacy group. And they said that interactions with right-leaning pages dropped in the aftermath of Facebook's temporary ban. Okay, and that right and left posts means content from both sides actually started to draw more equal amounts of engagement as compared to when Trump was freewheeling with his social media lah. Okay, and they said this actually reversed a long trend in America of right-wing content outperforming other political content. So basically what they meant was that it reduced the polarization on the internet a little bit. It kind of just balanced it out lah. Yeah.
Wow.
So there are really good opinions on both sides about this issue about free speech lah.
Yes.
Now, my personal opinion right now at this point, okay, I'm very happy that Trump got banned. And I actually feel Twitter did it too little, too late. Yeah. So I've always said this. I love this verse in Proverbs, which is the life and death are on our tongue verse. And most of the time in church, we only preach it in terms of an interpersonal level, which is like we tell people, hey, be encouraging with your words. Don't tear people down with your words, that level. Okay?
Yes.
But I think what concerns me is what we're seeing in the world today is on a huge scale, this verse being applied to a huge cultural level, which is our words on the internet are having these crazy impacts on life. And our language is creating these huge chasms that are manifesting not just in the US, but just all over the world.
Yeah.
So to me, if ever there were an argument for being cautious with how we're living and doing free speech, I've always been conflicted. Like, it's not that I land one way, I land the other way, and then depending on the situation, I'm very conflicted and very confused.
Yeah.
But I do think we need to be careful lah.
Yeah, true. I think a lot of Christians, not Christians, but also Singaporeans think like free speech is just you can say anything you want. And I mean, like for us, that's a very kind of poor definition.
Yeah, for sure.
It becomes like an easy excuse of trolls on
Yeah, wow, I really hate it. I cannot stand it when trolls. And you see it quite often, in Singapore comments, right?
Yeah.
A lot of times when trolls get scolded on the internet in Singapore, right? Then the next thing they say is free speech. Yeah. So I think what has happened is we've taken this idea that's been popularized mostly by America, and we've kind of co-opted it. And that's fine, because that's the beauty of ideas. No one has ownership over an idea.
Yeah.
100% claim. And a concept idea can take on a life of its own in a new context lah. But I think because of that too, there's beauty, but there's also bad stuff that come along with it. We just get co-opted very poorly lah.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. So in its worst form, it becomes a rallying cry for bullies on social media. But I think the more common phenomenon we are seeing here in Singapore, our context, is what I would call false equivalency lah. So for example, 4 years ago when Donald Trump was elected to the presidency in the US, right? And then there was a hashtag that started trending in the US that was used by Democrats and liberals, hashtag NotMyPresident. Okay. And that was used on Trump because, in my opinion, because he was an alleged assaulter, sexual assaulter.
Yep.
I don't know if I said that right, but and fake news propagator, liar in chief, like racist. So that was used to depict him, that hashtag. But I think what happened was it came over to Singapore, and then some people, not all, started using it on our president, because that year we also had I can't call it a presidential election because technically it was a walkover.
Yes.
But presidential cycle, okay? And our president, Halimah Yacob, was elected as our president. And people started using the hashtag NotMyPresident on her. And there's a part of it I understand. There was some people saying they were criticizing this new system that we implemented in Singapore, which was that for the presidency, we had to rotate the four main races, the groups in Singapore for president, okay?
Yeah.
Now, I understand it can come off a bit token and there are issues with that, but I think we can talk about it and we can improve. What I didn't like was how we took the hashtag NotMyPresident and used it on a woman who is a minority and a woman who has a immensely great and wonderful track record of public service and who has been the Speaker of our House for many, many years.
Yes.
So in doing so, right, actually, it was originally used to protest a racist president, and now in Singapore it's been used as a tool to be racist towards our president. Yeah, so that's what I mean by false equivalency. So I think my point is we do need to, guys, be very careful how we use the idea of free speech lah.
Yeah.
And how we co-opt words. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I think social media has given everyone a voice and that every voice matters. But the truth is social media has given us the illusion that every opinion is valid.
Yeah.
It's not.
Yeah. We don't think so. Some people are going to scold us for that, but not every opinion is as valid as another opinion. Yeah. So I think free speech really, it's got to come, guys, with some responsibility and accountability for the things we put out there and the things we say lah.
Yes.
Yeah. And maybe some thoughtfulness as well. Okay. Because honestly speaking, I've been experimenting. You know this. Like, when to say something, when to stand up for something that's unjust. And each time I think it has been quite challenging, as someone whom I feel is still pretty green to social justice on the internet. But I do think it's important to then evaluate, right, each time we try something, like, was this effective? Was this kind? Did this move the conversation forward, or did it create more division with what I did online? So even with Uncommon Humanity, I think this is a way that we're trying to figure things out also. Like, how do we use our words to have good conversations, difficult conversations, uncomfortable conversations, but do it in a way that doesn't alienate other people?
Yes.
Yeah. So as we will have said in the intro today, right, we do reserve the right to grow and change. And we got to find a way to do words and to do humanity well lah.
And better.
Yeah. So the same week, I came across this Vice article written by Ko Lin Chiang, and it's entitled, "In This Singaporean Church, You Can Be Happy and Gay." Now again, trigger warning to all LGBTQ friends who are listening in. There's parts of what we're going to say now this article actually, if you go read it, it's pretty positive, okay? It features the only gay affirming church in Singapore, Free Community Church, and their pastors. And they came off amazing as really wanting to build bridges.
Yes.
However, there were some Christian leaders interviewed that came off really badly in this article. So if it's going to trigger you, please don't read it, okay?
Yes.
And right now, we are going to quote some of these things.
Yeah. So Lim said this in the article that FCC twists the Bible to suit what they want. And he made this comment. He said, "If you had asked me whether they'll be safe when they die, will they be in heaven? It's not for me to judge. God knows." But then he added on and said, "I would love to say they won't be." Oh my.
Yeah.
And then another Christian leader, Yang, said that he called being a happy homosexual Christian disturbing and a misleading lie.
Oh God, this one really actually makes me more angry than I expected. Yeah, because I'm like, so what? You'll only be happy if they are unhappy? LGBTQ person and a Christian. I mean, like, what does that even mean? It's just like you really need to go and reevaluate your whole idea of faith, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, but go on. He said something else.
Yes, and he wrote in his in one of his blog posts that, let me put it in simple and unambiguous terms, a homosexual Christian is an oxymoron. And in an email to Vice, he said that he is concerned for the faith of those who follow the pastors of SEC.
Yep. So we want to say, we want to give a little bit of grace here, okay? Which is maybe they were misquoted or quoted out of context, which that has happened to me before. So so I have a little bit of like empathy for that situation arising.
Yeah.
But there was another guy that was mentioned, and he actually wrote a confrontational open letter to FCC on Facebook, okay, which I actually went to go and read. Don't bother, guys. Yeah, which is he wrote a pretty confrontational open letter, and then after the next 2/3 of the letter, he just basically quoted throughout Bible verses. No explanation, no interpretation, no exegesis whatsoever. And like we said, again, to refer to our episode 2, all this behavior comes out of a very simplistic, God said so, the Bible says so kind of attitude. Okay? So let me be upfront here first.
Yeah.
You cannot just list Bible verses or say, this is what the Bible says, and therefore you are twisting things. Like, you see, guys, listen, interpreting the Bible is really not so simple. Now, there are some verses that are simpler, but there are a lot that are not. And there is a huge gap, you've got to understand this, between what's on the page, and then there's a gap of, I don't know, 2,000, 8,000 years worth of gap between the words on the pages and our interpretation today. And so we got to be very careful, right, with this gap and how we create ethics around our interpretation. Yeah. But secondly, Karis, you want to take this?
Yeah. I think secondly that we feel like the unkind tone is just not necessary. And definitely not Jesus. I think maybe a lot of times maybe Christians think they are standing up for Jesus. They're protecting the church against like a certain mentality, secularism. And the irony is that when we other or when we exclude or belittle someone else, then we are just behaving exactly
like the
culture.
Worst of polarization and culture lah. Yeah, so we keep thinking we're us against the world, but actually we're behaving exactly like the world that we supposedly detest.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. So one of the characteristics of polarization, right, is actually dehumanizing. Okay, now Brene Brown has a great podcast. We really encourage you to listen and subscribe to that podcast. But she released a great episode on this during the Capitol Hill situation. And she talked about polarization and this idea of dehumanizing. Okay, and that is human beings, right? So this is very interesting, about dehumanizing. Human beings, right? Apparently our brains don't allow us, we have a sort of fail-safe that doesn't allow us to easily kill another human being.
Oh, wow.
And so what dehumanizing is, for example, during World War II, in order for Hitler and the Nazis to commit atrocities against the Jews, they had to dehumanize the people that they were trying to destroy in order to feel okay with destroying them. So it's a weird coping mechanism, so to speak. So for example, things like the Rwandan genocide, the Tutsis and the Hutus, same thing happened. They were dehumanized, especially using language. So in that case, the Rwandan genocide, they would call the other group cockroaches and like low lives and stuff like that in order to justify killing them. So dehumanizing is a coping mechanism to help us destroy another human being because our brain actually doesn't allow it. So one of the features of polarization is, even if it doesn't resort to physical violence, you see this happening all over the internet, which is we belittle, we demonize, we dehumanize in order to attack somebody else and to feel okay with doing it. So one other thing that we've been listening to is the Aware saga. Okay, yes. I don't know whether you heard about this, but if you haven't, right, go listen to it. It's a very well done docu-podcast on Spotify, okay, about this incident in 2010 where some fundamental Christians tried to take over Aware homophobic fundamental Christians tried to take over aware. Okay, so very exciting stuff here. Go and listen to it. But in one episode 3, again, if you are LGBTQ friend, I would advise, if you're not prepared, don't listen to it. Okay, because it has sound bites of when the argument to repeal 377A was first made in Parliament. Okay, so when I was listening to that event, the lawyer making the arguments for the repeal actually made a very measured, heartfelt, very touching, and I would say pretty logical argument for the repeal. But then the opposing lawyer, Theo Lee An, okay, that argument, oh my God, like it really got into my bones when I was listening to it. It drove me nuts, okay. First, the first half that they showed, right, in my opinion, as someone who is a thinker and likes to argue things well, wow, she just threw out a lot of fancy words, lengthy sentences with 1,000,001 adjectives. And you know, when I listen to someone argue like that, my first instinct is like, okay, you basically are BSing your way through this because you don't have a very good logical argument, so you are just throwing out fancy words. Okay, so there was no strong logic.
Yeah.
Then the second half, which was the part that was really, really bad, she started throwing out, like just talking about gay sex in very dehumanizing, demeaning terms, and it was just, she was very, very bullying. And she made one comment that I think is still in infamy until today, like 10 years later, about something about like gay sex being like trying to drink water up your nose using a straw.
Oh no.
In Parliament. And I think the sad part was the lawyer who was arguing for repeal said he was so discouraged because when she was done, a significant portion of Parliament cheered.
Oh no.
So it was just really dismal lah. Yeah. So again, if you identify as LGBTQ, please just skip that episode. So I think case in point, right, when we shame and we dehumanize another person, and when we do things like that on social media, or we release statements and quotes like in the Vice article, and we use our words to belittle, to attack, to destroy, we're actually really playing into this really terrible part of humanity. So I'm sad to say, I think the way that we're doing Christianity in Singapore, we've created a Christianity of power. And the extreme manifestation of it is we get away with saying very unthoughtful things. You know, we are unchecked with our bullying, with our privilege and our unkindness. So when I read this article and I go, when you shame LGBTQ Christians or the LGBTQ community, really it ends up saying more about you than it does about them. Yeah, because I'm not ever sure I ever saw Jesus in my Bible ever speaking harshly to the other. I mean, most of the time, right, if I recall, Jesus spoke harshly to power and privilege, to the Pharisees.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. And Jesus was actually pretty subversive and radical in the way he loved and he included people at his table.
Yeah. I think Christians, we struggle with this idea of like truth and love. We struggle with speaking the truth in love, to be kind. And we also struggle with putting love before our supposedly so-called truth.
Yeah.
And our whole point is just like, we got to be kind.
Pick love above rules and regulations. Again, you know, over being a Pharisee. Okay, sorry. So here's the thing I want to bring across, right? The LGBTQ community is a marginalized community.
Yeah.
Which means, guys, there is an asymmetrical dynamic at play. Okay, which is you and I, if we are straight people, we have access to rights that they do not. And sometimes one of the behaviors of our privilege is we can get away with a lot of things, with saying things that are hurtful, because it's almost as though minority groups become slightly invisible to us, the majority lah.
Yeah.
So one of the things that come up for me time and again, right, some Christians come to me and say to me, you know, what does it matter? You know how I as a Christian speak about LGBTQ persons, because there are no queer people in my church, what? And I really want to laugh when they say this to me, you know. But they are unconvinced when I tell them, like, no, there are LGBTQ people around you. They are just not telling you, even if they are your friend.
Yeah.
Because you're not safe to tell. Because it wouldn't be acceptable in the community environment that they are in. And another accusation, now this one really annoys me to death, right, that I've heard many Christians make is like, but why are they so militant in their fight for equal rights? I mean, hello. Just look at how we use our militant language and how we go after them. Like, I think it might be us that's like stirring up the fight and being very militant.
Yeah.
You see, here's my logic, right? Sometimes, why do communities have to protest? Why do they have to speak their mind? It's because when they speak normally, no one's listening. And so they have to speak louder. It's not that they are militant, it's because we've covered and repressed their voice. So if anything, I think they should speak louder so that we pay attention to what it is that they need.
Yes.
Yeah.
So PC, with regards to 377A, what are your thoughts?
Okay, so I'm going to try to hitch this in a different way to help Christians be a little bit more open to the idea that it is okay to support the repeal of 377A. Okay, and interestingly, I'm going to do it in terms of language. Okay, so for those of you tuning in and you don't know, right, what 377A is basically a legacy law passed down from British colonial times, criminalizing sex between men. Okay, now interesting fact, England has done away with the law, but it still exists in Singapore. Okay, now the government has said repeatedly it is not an enforced law, but it stays on the books none the same. Okay, now this complicates matters for a few reasons. For example, one, if we were in a situation where a man got raped by another man, it would be tricky, technically speaking, under the law to report the situation, especially if you are a gay man and not a straight man, to report the situation and gain redress over it. Okay, so even if, let's say, that were not the case and the police were to entertain the situation, the courts were to have a compassionate response to the situation, that law still creates a lot of fear among gay men in the community about whether they can come forward if something like that has happened to them. Okay, so it's a very problematic law, and it brings with it also a ripple effect of a host of other things, which is in Singapore, for example, you can't create sex education in schools that apply to LGBTQ youth. You cannot create resources that support the community. You cannot easily overcome the censorship issues with having positive role models of positive portrayals of LGBTQ persons in Singapore media. So you end up again with the horrible stereotype that gay people are a certain look, a certain way, a certain type. It really hinders progress with regards to the conversation on this issue. Okay.
Yes.
But to hedge it a different way, for all those Christians who are going, but, it's not right according to the Bible, again, it's complicated. I would say there are good arguments on both sides, solid arguments, but we cannot get into that today. Okay, but to put it in another way on an ethical level, years and years ago, in the US, there was a fight in America over abortion rights. Okay, so now again, I'm going to have to state, I am pro-life. I've said it before, I am pro-life. I'm 99% pro-life as a Christian. Okay, but I think that it's complicated. So in the US, what happened was there was a court case called Roe versus Wade, before the Supreme Court to argue for the rights of women to have access to legal abortion. Now, of course, that law ended up passing on a federal level, and one of the great supporters of that passing was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, one of my heroes, great advocate of human rights Supreme Court justice. Okay. However, what was interesting in her summary arguments after the law was passed, she raised a concern, which was she didn't like the idea of legalized abortion being hedged under the term women's rights. Now, let me explain to you why. She thought that it would create greater division between the left and the right in America, that what needed to happen was to win over conservatives to understand that this was an important ethical policy that needed to happen in America. But because it was hedged under women's rights. So, for example, actually what she thought would happen has played out many, many decades later, okay? Which was, for example, recently I heard a Christian commentator say, who is again actually for women's rights, but he said he was very disturbed when he saw a woman during the Women's Rights March wearing a t-shirt that said, "I've had 20 abortions and counting, and I'm proud of it." And for him, it really couldn't gel with his Christian values. And let me say straight up, that also cannot gel with my Christian values. I don't think that it's a responsible way to live life.
Yeah.
Okay. So RBG argued that it should have been termed women's protections instead of women's rights. So that is actually how I want to put it across to the Christians that are tuning in, okay, that repealing 377A is not just an issue of rights. It's an issue of protections, equal protections for the LGBT community as much as we as straight people have protections.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it boils down to the little real life things like, for example, if I had a spouse who was dying in the hospital, I would immediately have the right to be in that room and to make medical decisions on behalf of my spouse. But for an LGBTQ person, that is off the table. They can literally be barred from entering the place because you are not technically a blood relative or a spouse. It prevents, for example, things like having legal rights as a spouse that each of us has under the law. So rather than look at it as they are trying to steal your rights, just look at it as actually this is an issue of we should be willing and happy to give them equal protections, that it is only right. So that is really where I stand on the issue of 377A lah. Now again, let me say this. I do not want it to become a thing that like what is my stance is my stance. It does not necessarily reflect any official stance in our church or any theological stance. But I land very sympathetic to the issue that I think it's only right and good and loving, and in my opinion, Jesus, to care for a person's equal protection under the law.
Yes. So PC, what if Christian, right, still say that they disagree? How should they go about engaging with the world? Like, should they?
Well, specifically the issue, right? I think, can you go read some other Christian scholars about this issue? Because really, honestly speaking, as someone who has read up on different scholars, I would say that there are actually really compelling arguments on both sides that are solid. There are also equally weak arguments on all sides. So for example, if you are still arguing Sodom and Gomorrah, right, my goodness, even conservative landing scholars on this issue say that that is really a bad argument and a lousy verse to use, which is actually really used a lot in Singapore context. Okay, please stop it. Yeah, go read up. You know, don't be afraid of opposite view. Why don't you go read up, and you might be surprised that actually that it could actually almost be equal in the argumentation, and then really you realize that interpretation is not easy.
Yeah.
And then a step down, then figuring out how to do interpretation to real life is again another step that is very, very tricky lah.
Yes.
Yeah.
PC, what if we still disagree? Then is tolerance the way to go?
Yeah, let's just qualify right now. Chansey is just playing, Karis is just playing devil's advocate. Okay. Yeah, okay. So I listened to this professor recently on the Veritas Forum. So again, Christians, that's a very good one to go follow. They give some very nuanced arguments on theology and faith. And his name is Vinod Ramachandra. And he says this, very interesting. He says, tolerance is an excuse not to engage.
Oh.
So I used to think tolerant is the way to go, right? Like, hey, if you cannot agree, then at least be tolerant. But he raised, the complication of the word tolerance is who is tolerating whom? And who determines who gets a seat at the table in order to be heard? Yeah. So I think we're living in a time where it's so important to learn the language of dialogue and to understand the dynamics of power and privilege, that the problem is the opposite voice is not getting much of a seat at the table to be heard. And it's just predominantly, overwhelmingly in the Christian context, like overwhelmed by very conservative voices.
Yeah.
So another guy that I really respect, his name is Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, and he wrote this book. I think it's Difference with Dignity. I could be wrong. Please Google that again. But one of the interesting things he said is we need to learn to do difference with dignity.
Oh.
And he says this, can we recognize God's image in someone who is not in my image?
Wow.
And he thinks this is really the problem with polarization today.
Yeah.
So you see, if you read the Vice article, you'll see a clear enough picture that the pastors of FCC are actually very thoughtful about theology. They are not like maliciously twisting the word or cannot be bothered to understand the Bible. They're actually very, very thoughtful, and they're trying actually very hard to build bridges with conservatives who are trying to push them away.
Yes.
So again, don't paint LGBTQ people with this stereotype big brush of they are militant, they are not thoughtful, they're twisting the Bible. You know, it really could be that at this point, mainstream Christians, we are the ones hindering the process of conversation and relationship and not them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if your way of engaging with the world is just, Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, and the only way and the only truth and the life, then, friend, I think really we got to find a better way to do our Christianity.
Yes.
Yeah, because that's not working at all. It never worked and it's still not working.
So, PC, you have another issue, right? Which is you think that you're concerned that the conversation is dominated by a few voices.
Yeah. But I think that's polarization for you, right? It's dominated by the loudest on the internet.
Yeah.
And I think in this case with Christianity and the LGBTQ issue, it's dominated by a few media savvy, a few powerful people. And obviously through the Vice article, people with enough ego to pull it off. Yeah, but I think, okay, joking aside, okay, because you see, case in point, you see, I am belittling right now, right? Okay, so I'm trying to learn too and figure it out. But I think the problem becomes everyone in the middle, which is actually the majority, the moderate majority, is too scared to hold and to speak up about their more moderate view because we are afraid of the few.
Yeah.
So I think even for me, right, sometimes I feel like I'm too liberal for the conservatives. And then I'm too conservative for the liberal, which is a very crazy place to be, right? Because last time it used to be like, Jesus said, if you're lukewarm, you're not hot, no cold. I will spit you out my mouth. Now I'm like, oh my God, like, now it's like, okay. But anyway, my point is this, okay?
Yeah.
I think my worry is that fear is making it very, very hard for there to be any innovation in church life and relationship and theology.
Yeah.
It's making it very hard for love, for goodness, for creativity in the way that we do community. And so what I've seen recently, which is, I think I raised in episode 1, and actually why partly we're doing this podcast, right, is there's so much innovation on a very superficial level in church life. Our social media has updated. We're trying to use more cool hashtags and language and nicer pictures and dressing.
Yeah.
But then on the relational level, nothing substantial has changed or evolved in Christianity. And that is very, very worrying because I feel we're lacking in genuine, real transformation to be more like Jesus in the world. Yeah, so I guess to end it off and to land today,
Yeah.
I think as Christian leaders, we need to have more humility. I think we need to be more aware about the church culture that we're setting with our words. We need to dare to admit and cop to the fact that we don't know everything.
Yeah.
And to be kind with
Yes.
our words instead of a know-it-all with our words.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you want to end with the disclaimer too?
Yes.
One more time, I think maybe for the third time today.
Yeah, for our disclaimer, which is we want to say that our views are not necessarily the official views of our church, and we definitely reserve the right to change on these issues.
Yeah. So guys, go out there, be kind with your words, because words matter. You could make the world less, or you could make it a better place.
Yeah.
See you.